Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I've always been one to enjoy the sound of rain. There's something soothing about it, isn't there? The soft patter on the roof, the rhythmic beat against the windows, the gentle hum of water trickling down the street. I always found it comforting, almost like a lullaby for my mind, a gentle way to ease into sleep at night, or focus during the day. But that night was different. It had started like any other evening, the kind of rain that came down in sheets, a heavy downpour that made the world look blurred, like it was wrapped in fog. I sat by the window in my apartment, cup of tea in hand, watching the storm outside. It was the kind of rain that could make you forget where you were, enveloping everything in its soothing sound. The city felt distant, muffled under the heavy blanket of rain, but as I watched, the sound began to change. It wasn't that it got quieter, or that the rain tapered off. Gradually it stopped altogether. One moment the world was filled with the heavy drumming of the storm, and then the next silence, the kind of silence that almost felt unnatural, like the world had been cut off from itself. I blinked, looking around my small apartment, trying to make sense of it. The silence was unsettling. I hadn't even noticed how deeply the sound had seeped into me, until it was gone. My mind, so used to that constant hum, now seemed to be reaching for something that wasn't there. My gaze went back to the window, but there it was again, the sound of rain. It was still pouring outside, the streets shimmering with puddles and dark water, the air heavy with moisture. But the sound was still there, echoing in the silence of my apartment, like the storm hadn't left at all. The rain had stopped, yet the sound continued swirling around me, filling the air, relentless and steady. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the wind, maybe the building was old and the walls were carrying the sound of rain from somewhere else, from a distant part of the city. But no, the sound was too close to real. It was coming from within the apartment, from the air itself. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on the silence outside, the rain continued to echo in my ears, a constant drumming rhythm that wouldn't let go. I stood up from the window, walking into the living room, where the sound seemed to be coming from the farthest corner. There was nothing there, just the empty space, the quiet furnishings, the soft glow of the lamp by the door. But still the sound of rain filled the air, a low steady tapping. I could almost feel the wetness in the air, the cold humidity that had begun to gather around me. Though there was no rain to touch my skin, the sound was so persistent, so vivid, that I couldn't shake it. I could hear it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air that surrounded me. It felt like it was seeping into me, wrapping me in its rhythm. My pulse quickened, and I found myself walking around the apartment, trying to trace the source of the noise. But no matter where I went, it stayed the same, constant, implacable, the sound of rain that never stopped. I sat back down on the couch, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined the rain stopping. But when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, the sound. I turned on the television, hoping to distract myself, but the rain followed me. It didn't matter where I went or what I tried to do. It was everywhere. The rain filled the apartment like an invisible presence, a quiet, unyielding companion. I even checked the windows again, certain that there had to be something out there, a sign that the storm had never truly ended. But everything outside was still and dry. No rain, no water running down the glass. No evidence of the storm at all, but the sound, it was there, it was real. I tried to sleep. The rain kept me awake, its constant drumming in my ears making it impossible to drift off. I pulled the blanket over my head, hoping that would help, but it didn't. The sound didn't stop. It never stopped. It was as though the storm was now a part of me, clinging to the edges of my mind, playing its rhythm in the background of every thought, every moment. It was around 2 a.m. when I finally gave up trying to ignore it. I stood up again, walking around my apartment in a daze. The apartment was silent now, but the rain, the sound was there, filling the space like a quiet, invisible pressure. It felt like I was living in a dream. I reached for my phone, hoping to hear something different, maybe a call, a text, just to break the illusion of the rain's constant presence, but there was nothing, just the steady, insistent sound that wouldn't let go. I thought of calling someone, but what would I say? The rain's still here, but it isn't outside. It sounded absurd. Even in my mind, still I had to do something. The pressure was too much. I stood by the door, my hand resting on the knob, half tempted to step outside to feel the rain on my skin, again to prove to myself that it had stopped. I opened the door. There was no rain, the streets were quiet, the air dry. The storm had ended, but the sound of it never did. It followed me everywhere I went, every step I took. It was always there, a soft tapping in the back of my mind, like the constant gentle drumming of rain that never ended. I couldn't escape it, and as I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, I realized that the sound, whatever it was, wasn't something I would ever be able to leave behind. It was there with me always, and I couldn't tell if it was in the world around me, or if it had moved inside into the very fabric of my mind. I was no longer sure where the rain had stopped, or if it ever had. The sound was just there in the air, and in me, and it would never let me forget that storm. It was one of those damp, overcast afternoons when the rain had started falling slowly, almost like it was hesitant to make up its mind, the kind of rain that lingers, soft but persistent, the kind that soaks you to the bone if you're out in it long enough. I was running errands, a simple task really, but the weather seemed to complicate it somehow. As I made my way to the small cafe on the corner, hoping to get out of the drizzle for just a few minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the day felt off. I reached the cafe and pulled open the door, escaping the steady drizzle outside, and stepped into the warmth. The bell above the door chimed lightly, and I shook off my umbrella, letting the raindrops fall from it before tucking it into the stand by the door. The atmosphere inside was cozy, warm light spilling from hanging bulbs, and the soft hum of quiet conversation mixed with the low background music. It was a little crowded, but not unbearably so. I stepped up to the counter to order my usual, a hot coffee, black, no sugar. As I waited, I noticed her. She was sitting by the window, a single figure in a simple dark coat, looking out at the rain. Her back was to me, but I could see that her hair cascaded in dark waves, the kind of hair that looked like it belonged in a shampoo commercial, thick, shiny, effortlessly perfect. It was odd, but in a moment of passing curiosity, I realized something strange. The rest of the cafe was filled with the low hum of chatter and the soft sound of raindrops hitting the windows, yet the sound of her hair, or the absence of it, stood out. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but I kept glancing back toward her. Her hair, her long dark hair, it wasn't wet at all. The storm outside had picked up in intensity, the rain now coming down in sheets, the kind that left the streets glistening and puddled. I had felt it when I walked in the dampness, the chill of it still lingering in my jacket. But there she was, sitting by the window, her hair perfectly dry. Not even a single drop of rain had touched it, as if she was shielded by something invisible, a bubble of protection. In the middle of the storm, I felt an odd, creeping discomfort spread through me, but I shook it off. I was just over it was nothing. I turned back to the counter, grabbed my coffee, and found a seat near the back, still glancing toward her occasionally. She had shifted slightly now, facing me directly, her eyes catching mine for a fraction of a second, and when she Did she smile? It was a soft smile, warm, genuine. Even it wasn't an awkward, forced smile. No, it was as if she had known me for years, and her expression carried a kind of familiarity that felt comforting at first, yet the smile lingered for a moment. Too long it didn't break, and I couldn't help but notice that even as the warmth of her expression spread across her face, her hair remained untouched by the storm. It was as if time had stopped for that moment, as if the rain itself had no power over her. I forced myself to look away, focusing back on my coffee. The unease had settled deeper in my chest. I felt like I had entered some odd little pocket of reality where nothing quite made sense. Why had I noticed that? Why had I been staring so intently? A soft shiver crawled up my spine, but I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was just the rain. I was tired, my mind was playing tricks on me. Minutes passed. I could feel the storm outside growing fiercer, the howling wind pushing against the windows, but her hair, her dry, flawless hair, never moved. I watched as she got up, her figure moving gracefully, effortlessly, as she made her way to the door. The bell chimed again as she exited, but something stopped me from turning to see her leave. A strange knot had formed in my stomach, the lingering feeling that I wasn't supposed to notice the strange things about her, that somehow it was a breach of something. I couldn't explain it. I sat there for a while, the cup of coffee in my hands warming me, but the cold dread in my chest never really left. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe I was just tired, too caught up in my own head. It was a simple moment after all, nothing unusual. But then, as I was finishing my coffee, something made me look up again. It wasn't her, not exactly, but I could have sworn I saw her standing at the door of the cafe again. Her figure was silhouetted against the bright, stormy backdrop outside, her hair still untouched by the rain, her eyes now fixed on me, though I couldn't make out the expression. It was her, and yet it wasn't. I blinked, and in that fraction of a second she was gone. There was nothing at the door, only the rain now pounding against the windows with a ferocity that matched the feeling growing in my chest. My stomach churned. I left the cafe shortly after, stepping back out into the heavy rain. I wasn't sure why, but I had to see if I could find her again. Maybe I'd misunderstood the whole situation. The rain had been so thick outside, so relentless. Maybe I'd just imagined it, but there was something about her, something about the way she smiled at me, and how her hair never got wet, that I couldn't shake. The streets were empty, the rain now falling in torrents. I looked around, scanning the pavement, the doorways, the darkened corners, but she was nowhere in sight. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for the rain to stop, maybe for the world to shift and return to something that felt normal. But as I walked through the storm, I kept wondering, had I truly seen her, or had the weather, the atmosphere, played some cruel trick on my mind? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to notice what I had. That somehow I had crossed the line. And now, as I walked through the downpour, I couldn't help but think, what if she had been waiting for me to look at her hair, to notice? What if the smile, the perfection of her still dry form in the middle of a storm, was something I was never meant to understand? And what would happen next time I saw her? The rain had come out of nowhere. 1 minute the sky was clear, the air warm with the scent of early summer, and then, as though it had been waiting for the right moment, the clouds descended quickly, heavy and swollen, and the sky turned dark. I'd been walking down the street when it hit, a sudden downpour, thick and unforgiving, drenching me before I could even find shelter. I didn't mind sometimes. There's something oddly peaceful about being caught in the rain, the sensation of it washing over you, cleansing you in its intensity. So I kept walking, letting the rain soak into my clothes, feeling the chill of the droplets on my skin, the weight of the sky above pressing down on me, I found a small alley, a place I'd passed countless times before, and ducked into its shelter, hoping to wait out the storm, the sounds of the city, the hum of distant traffic. The murmur of pedestrians faded into a soft blur. As the rain became the only thing I could hear, the gentle but persistent tap of water against the pavement, the occasional gust of wind pushing the rain sideways, creating a kind of rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I stood there for a moment, my eyes closed, letting the sound of the rain fill my ears, my chest rising and falling with each breath I took. I could feel the coolness of it seep into my bones, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt grounding, like I was one with the storm, as if time itself had paused just for me. I opened my eyes again, but the world that greeted me was no longer the same. The alley, the buildings, they were gone, and their place was a vast expanse, an endless stretch of land that seemed to stretch on forever. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy like moss. Though it wasn't green, it was a deep, dark brown, almost like the earth itself had been soaked in rain for years. The air was thick, not with rain, but with something else, something heavy and strange. Like the air before a storm, but heavier, almost suffocating. I took a slow step forward, unsure of what was happening. The last thing I remembered was standing in the alley, the rain pouring down on me, but now there was no alley, no city around me. There was only this desolate landscape, bathed in a dim gray light that seemed to come from nowhere. The sky above me was low, pressing down like a heavy curtain, blocking out any sense of time. I didn't panic. Not at first. There was something about the stillness that made my mind slow, made everything seem distant, as though the world itself had slowed to match the pace of my heartbeat. I glanced around, trying to make sense of where I was. There was no sound here, no birds, no wind, just the deep silence broken only by my own breathing. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely perceptible at first, like the softest of sighs. It came from behind me, from somewhere off in the distance. I turned quickly, instinctively, but there was no one there. The landscape stretched on in every direction, vast and empty. There was no sign of life, but the whisper had been so clear, so distinct, that I could still feel it in my chest, like an echo reverberating inside me. I took another step forward, my heart beginning to quicken. The ground felt strange beneath my feet, like it was shifting ever so slightly with each movement. It wasn't solid earth, not really, more like something between the earth and water, soft but unyielding, like walking on the edge of a dream. And then I heard it again, the whisper, but this time louder, clearer. It sounded like my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one here, and yet it felt as though something or someone was calling to me from the edges of this strange place. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of the situation. Where was I? How had I gotten here? I had been in the alley just moments ago with the rain pounding down on me, and now I was in a place I didn't recognize, a place that didn't seem to exist. I turned around again, this time more slowly, as if waiting for something to happen, for something to reveal itself, and that's when I saw it. At the farthest point of the land, just on the edge of the horizon, there was a figure standing. It was far away, too far for me to make out any details, but I could tell it was human-shaped, tall, slender, with a kind of stillness to it that made it seem as if it were part of the landscape itself. I felt a strange pull toward it, an inexplicable urge to walk toward the figure, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The moment my eyes locked on it, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Something about the figure, its quiet, unmoving presence, unsettled me in a way I couldn't describe. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. My name, a voice so familiar, yet distant, like the echo of a forgotten memory. I couldn't resist it any longer. I took a step forward, then another, and soon I found myself walking toward the figure. With each step I took, the distance between us seemed to grow, and yet I couldn't stop. I was drawn to it, as though it was calling to me, pulling me forward, with an invisible thread. The air grew colder as I walked, the world around me more distorted, as though the landscape was shifting and changing. The figure remained at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach, yet closer with each step. I didn't know how long I walked. Time felt irrelevant here. The rain, the storm I had been caught in moments ago, had faded completely from my mind, as if it never existed. And then, as I neared the figure, everything stopped. The air became still, the land silent, and I stood there, staring at the figure. It hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged me, but somehow it felt like it was waiting for me. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow, and then just as I was about to reach out to it to understand what this place was, the figure disappeared. I blinked, and suddenly I was back where I started, in the alley, the rain falling around me, the world returning to its familiar shape, the buildings, the streetlights, the noise of the city. It was all there, as if nothing had changed. I stood there, drenched, my mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Had I been dreaming? Or had I truly crossed over into another place? I didn't know, but the feeling lingered, the strange, otherworldly sense of being somewhere I didn't belong, somewhere that existed just beyond the edge of reality. I closed my eyes, the rain still falling, the cool droplets against my skin. But this time, when I opened them again, I wasn't sure what world I had returned to, and a part of me wondered if I ever really left. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours, a constant rhythmic downpour that had turned the streets into rivers of dark water, flowing swiftly between the cracks in the pavement. I had been caught in it on my way home, of course, always the case with these unpredictable storms. I'd ducked into a small cafe to take shelter, hoping the worst would pass soon. The windows were fogged up, and the sound of rain tapping against the glass created a kind of comforting isolation, like the world outside didn't matter anymore. It was one of those late autumn storms, the kind that felt endless, as if the weather was determined to make up for all the sunshine it had neglected. People milled about in the cafe, ordering hot drinks and chatting quietly, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since I'd stepped inside. There was something off about the weather. The sky had been so dark when I arrived, the clouds thick and heavy, but now they seemed strange, not just dark, but almost oppressive, like the air was pressing down from all sides. I glanced out the window. The street was deserted, save for a few soggy pedestrians rushing to their destinations, umbrellas pulled tightly over their heads. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but the cafe provided a small cocoon of warmth, and for a while I was content to simply watch the storm. But after a few minutes, something strange began to happen. The rain, still pouring heavily on the other side of the street, suddenly stopped. Just like that. One moment, it was there, washing over the sidewalks, splashing against the window. The next moment, it was gone. Completely gone. The street across from me was dry, the pavement gleaming as though it hadn't rained at all. I blinked, leaning forward, thinking I had misunderstood, but no, the rain hadn't slowed. It had vanished on my side of the street. The rain was still falling in a relentless torrent, as if the storm refused to relent. But across the road, it was as if the storm had been suspended, halted, as though a boundary had been drawn that only I could see. I looked around at the other patrons in the cafe. No one else seemed to notice. They were all talking, sipping their coffee, going about their business, as if the storm outside was perfectly normal. but I couldn't stop staring at the window, the dividing line between wet and dry, between the storm and calm. I felt like I was caught in some strange in-between space where time or weather had lost all meaning. It didn't make sense. I had been watching the rain fall just moments before the streets on my side of the road, soaked through water, pooling in the gutters. Yet across the street, the pavement was dry, the ground glistening, untouched by the storm. The dry area seemed to stretch farther than it should have. I could see the farthest corner of the street, usually drenched by rain, perfectly dry, as if the weather had simply changed its mind. I decided I needed to leave. I stood up abruptly, paying for my coffee and making my way toward the door. The cold air hit me instantly, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the cafe. I stepped outside, half expecting the rain to stop as soon as I crossed the threshold, but it didn't. It continued to pour down as harsh and unrelenting as it had been for the past hour. I glanced back at the cafe, where I had just come from. The windows, once obscured by raindrops, were now perfectly clear. I could see the reflection of the street outside, the wet ground glistening in the artificial light from inside, but across the street there was no rain, no sign of the storm at all. The dry patch continued stretching into the distance, as if the storm had bypassed one side of the street completely. I took a hesitant step forward, crossing the street, drawn to the dry side, the strange, peaceful side of the street. I was sure I was imagining it, but as I stepped over to the other side, the rain seemed to follow me. The moment my foot touched the sidewalk across the street, the water that had been falling just moments ago was gone. The ground was dry, and I couldn't feel the sting of the cold rain on my skin. I looked up and noticed the sky had cleared slightly, the dark clouds beginning to part, revealing faint glimpses of stars, as if the storm had simply given up. It was only then that I realized what was wrong. I had crossed to the other side of the street, but the world around me hadn't shifted the way I thought it would. The streetlights were still flickering, weakly casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The people walking by still wore their coats, still hurried to their destinations, but everything felt wrong. The air was too still, the quiet too pronounced. It felt like a trap, a gentle but impenetrable barrier that I could no longer escape. I turned around almost instinctively, but the street behind me was gone. The cafe, where I had just been, was no longer there. Instead, there was just a long, empty stretch of road, an unbroken path that led nowhere. The buildings seemed to recede, as if they were fading into the distance. The dry patch of sidewalk stretched before me like a ribbon, but I couldn't see where it ended or where I had come from. My heart began to race. The sudden realization of being utterly alone, cut off from everything familiar. There was no one else around, no sign of life. The world felt quiet. Too quiet. It was as if I had stepped into another version of reality, one that wasn't mine, and I was caught in the space between two worlds, the storm that I couldn't escape, and the strange, empty calm that had swallowed everything else. The rain resumed then, just behind me, softly at first, then picking up, returning in a gentle but steady patter, as if to remind me that I couldn't escape it. I turned again, and this time I was sure the road on my side of the street was soaked once more, the rain falling in torrents, just as it had before. I stood there for a long time, the storm still raging round me, but not touching the space I had crossed into. The dry patch stretched forward, but I couldn't follow it any longer. I was lost between two places, caught in a storm that had ended, but only on my side of the street. It was one of those cold autumn evenings, the kind where the damp air clings to your skin, and the chill seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you put on. The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, and by the time I made my way to The bus stop, the streets were slick with puddles reflecting the soft glow of streetlights. I had left work later than usual, and the bus I was waiting for seemed like it would never come. I stood there tucked under the small awning of the bus stop, trying to stay dry, watching the rain tap against the glass. The noise of the city was muffled by the steady patter of the storm, and the world felt quieter than it usually did. My coat, already soaked through, wasn't doing much to protect me from the chill, and I pulled the collar higher around my neck, trying to shield my face from the wind. It was then that I noticed her. She was standing just a little farther down the sidewalk, closer to the corner, under the protection of a small storefront. I hadn't seen her arrive, but there she was standing still, facing the rain, almost as if she were waiting for something or someone. Her figure was silhouetted against the dim light of the street, and her umbrella, which I could barely see through the haze of rain, seemed almost useless against the heavy downpour. She was dressed simply in a long coat, its hem fluttering slightly in the breeze, and she held her umbrella tightly, shielding her from the rain. I wasn't sure why I looked at her longer than I should have. Something about her seemed out of place, as though she didn't belong there in the midst of this quiet, mundane evening. She was standing alone, her posture so still, almost rigid, that it seemed unnatural, but I quickly dismissed the thought. After all, we were all just waiting for the bus. It was a quiet night, and there was no need to think too much about a person standing alone. Minutes passed, and the bus still hadn't arrived. The cold had begun to seep into my bones more deeply, and I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering slightly. That was when I noticed her walking toward me, her umbrella barely keeping the rain off her. She moved closer to the shelter of the bus stop, and I could see her face now. She looked tired, her eyes dark and distant, as though she hadn't slept in days. She glanced at me briefly, but there was no warmth in her gaze. It wasn't cold exactly, it was more like she wasn't really seeing me, but something beyond me. Her gaze lingered on me for only a moment, and then she stepped closer, stopping just beside me under the awning. I nodded politely, unsure what else to do. I didn't want to seem rude, but I wasn't really expecting her to say anything. She stood there in silence, her eyes still distant, her face partially obscured by the rain and her coat collar. The air between us felt thick, as though something unsaid lingered, and I wondered if she was waiting for something, or if she was simply caught in the same loop of mindless waiting as the rest of us. Then she turned to me, and almost as if she had just remembered something, pulled off her coat and held it out toward me. "Here," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You'll be warmer in this for a moment." I stood there stunned. I didn't know what to say. Why would she offer me her coat, a coat that she had clearly been wearing for some time, in the middle of the storm? I hesitated, glancing at the wet fabric that hung loosely in her hands. It was drenched, the dark fabric clinging to the folds of her fingers, water dripping from it in steady streams. I could already see the droplets running down her arms, soaking her sleeves. The coat was heavy, saturated with rain, and I could feel the weight of it as she held it out to me. "No thank you," I replied a little too quickly. "I'm fine." She didn't seem surprised, didn't even flinch at my refusal. Instead, she simply stood there, holding the coat out to me for a moment longer, her eyes still not meeting mine. It was as if she didn't hear me at all, or perhaps she didn't care. Her gaze was somewhere far away, lost in thoughts I couldn't understand. I took a step back, wanting to distance myself from the strange gesture, but she didn't move. She didn't put the coat down either. She just stood there waiting for me to take it, her hand trembling slightly, water running off the fabric and onto the pavement. The air around us felt heavier, as though the rain had stopped being a natural part of the world, and had become something darker, something heavier that pressed against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. The seconds felt like minutes, and I suddenly felt like I was caught in an unspoken trap. She wasn't going to leave until I accepted the coat, but the coat, it didn't make sense. She had been wearing it, and it was soaked through. Why would she want me to wear it? It wasn't warm at all. It would only make me colder. She seemed to understand my hesitation, and after a long pause she gave me a faint, almost imperceptible smile, as though it was all part of some quiet understanding between us then. Just as I was about to open my mouth to refuse again, she dropped the coat onto the ground at my feet, her fingers loosening their grip. As if she had been holding on to it for far too long, the fabric hit the pavement with a soft, wet thud. She didn't look at it, didn't look at me. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps soft against the damp street, her figure blending into the shadow of the night. I stared at the coat for a moment longer, its dark, wet fabric lying on the ground like something abandoned. I should have picked it up, I thought, should have at least acknowledged her strange kindness, but something about it felt wrong. The rain seemed to fall harder, the droplets hitting the coat in a soft rhythmic beat. The coat didn't move, didn't stir, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me to reach out. I turned away, finally feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on me. The bus arrived a moment later, and I boarded it in silence, the coat still lying abandoned on the pavement. I never saw her again, but every time it rains I remember the strange kindness of her offer, the wet coat, and the look in her eyes, a look that said everything without saying a word. And sometimes in the stillness of those quiet rainy nights I can almost hear the sound of her footsteps behind me fading slowly into the distance. The rain had subsided, just as I made my way down the familiar path along the river. It was late afternoon, and the sky was still heavy with clouds, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a lingering dampness in the air. The world felt quieter now. The usual hum of traffic softened by the gentle lapping of the river against the bank. I liked to walk along the river when I needed space to think. The rhythmic sound of the water always brought a kind of calm that I couldn't find elsewhere. The path curved along the water, lined with old trees whose branches swayed softly in the breeze. I had walked this path countless times before, and on those occasions it always felt the same: the soft crunch of gravel beneath my feet, the cool touch of the air, and the constant flow of the river were a comforting backdrop to my thoughts. But today, as I passed the old stone bridge that arched over the river, something felt different. I stopped for a moment, listening. I thought I heard something faint, a distant sound, barely audible over the gentle rush of the water. It sounded like laughter at first, but not the adult kind. This was a high, sweet sound, like the laughter of children. I tilted my head slightly, straining my ears to catch it. Again the laughter grew clearer. It was soft at first, like the gentle echo of something just out of reach, but then it solidified into a melody, a tune. Children's voices, light and carefree, were singing in harmony. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a simple melody that drifted through the air like the wind itself was carrying it. I turned toward the bridge, my heart thudding in my chest for reasons I couldn't explain. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone under the bridge. The area was quiet, isolated, even especially after the rain. I glanced around. The path was empty, no other walkers in sight. I couldn't see anyone standing near the bridge, but the voices, the singing, it was unmistakable. I felt a strange pull toward the sound, like it was beckoning me, calling me closer. A part of me hesitated, a small voice warning me to turn away, but curiosity pushed me forward. I crossed over the small wooden footbridge that led to the base of the stone arch, where the singing seemed to be coming from. As I neared the bridge's support beams, I stopped again, listening intently. The voices were clearer now, soft and innocent, but there was an undertone to them, something unsettling beneath the sweetness the children were singing. A simple lullaby, their voices blending in eerie harmony, but the more I listened, the more I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It was as if the song was too perfect to still. It felt wrong, like it had been frozen in time, trapped in the air. I looked beneath the bridge, expecting to see a group of children, but the space was empty. There were no figures, no shadows, just the quiet trickle of the river and the overgrown vines creeping up the stone walls. Still the singing persisted, the voices growing louder, clearer, but now it seemed to come from within the bridge itself. I could no longer tell if the children were standing beneath it, or if the sound was coming from deeper inside the structure, from the hollow, forgotten spaces of the bridge. I took a step closer, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The gravel crunched loudly in the silence, but the singing didn't falter. It was almost as if the voices were reaching through the very stone, weaving themselves into the fabric of the world around me. The melody twisted in my mind, familiar and alien all at once, like I had heard it before, but couldn't quite remember where. I felt a cold gust of wind rushed past me, a sudden chill that made my skin prickle. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, unnerved. But then I caught sight of something, a flicker of movement under the bridge just beneath the archway. I leaned in, squinting, my pulse quickening. There was something there, something small and indistinct. But it was moving. It was like a shadow, a blur that seemed to shift and flicker with every blink. I stepped back again, a surge of unease gripping me. The singing grew louder now, more insistent, and I could almost hear words in the melody, words that didn't quite make sense. The voices, once sweet, now felt almost pleading, as though they were begging for attention, begging to be heard. I turned away, my feet moving faster now, away from the bridge, away from the sound, but the singing didn't stop. It followed me, echoing in the back of my mind, in the hollow spaces between my thoughts. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, still waiting under the bridge, and that the voices I had heard weren't meant for me. They were meant for someone else, someone who could hear them. By the time I reached the end of the path, the singing had faded, but the feeling remained. It lingered like the faintest trace of a dream, too vivid to forget, but too elusive to fully grasp. The voices had vanished into the wind, but I couldn't help but wonder who had been singing and why the sound had drawn me in. I've walked that path many times since, but I haven't heard the singing again. I tell myself it was just a trick of the mind, a strange echo of sound carried by the wind, but there's a part of me that wonders. Every time I pass the bridge, I find myself glancing over, half expecting to hear those sweet, eerie voices again. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear them, just on the edge of my hearing, soft and distant, the children singing under the bridge, their voices calling out across the river, as though they've been waiting for me to listen once more. It was one of those mornings that should have felt like any other, the kind of ordinary day that almost slips away before you realize it's begun. The sun was low still, struggling to push through the clouds, casting long shadows over the streets. The air was crisp, as it often is, just before the true bite of autumn sets in, but something about the day felt slightly off. I couldn't quite place it at first. I was running late for work as usual, but I didn't mind. The routine felt comforting, almost meditative. I walked briskly down the familiar path that led to the bus stop, my shoes clicking against the pavement, the early morning silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost unreal, as if the world was holding its breath. As I rounded the corner, I spotted it, a large puddle reflecting the sky above. It was one of those perfect puddles, still and clear, where the surface was so smooth that the sky seemed to be staring back at me in perfect symmetry. There was something strangely inviting about it, something that made me pause for just a moment. Even though I was already late, I bent down trying to catch my reflection in the water, but when I looked at the sky mirrored in the puddle, something caught me off guard. It wasn't right. The sky above me was cloudy, pale, and overcast, the kind of sky you'd expect on a mid-fall morning, but the reflection in the puddle, it was different. It was bright, clear blue, stretching endlessly like the sky in the middle of summer, not a single cloud to be seen. The colors were so vivid, so sharply defined, that for a moment I almost felt like I was looking into another world. My first thought was that I was just tired, that maybe the rainwater had collected in the puddle in a way that was distorting the reflection, making it seem like the seasons had shifted. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the confusion, but when I looked again, the reflection was still there. A perfect summer sky. It felt unsettling, though I couldn't explain why. The contrast between the autumn morning around me and the summer sky in the puddle was so jarring, so surreal, that I couldn't pull my gaze away. I felt a strange shiver creep up my spine, like the world itself had subtly changed without me noticing. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. The street was empty, as it should have been. At this hour I leaned closer to the puddle, mesmerized by the reflection, trying to make sense of it. The sky in the water was so vibrant, so alive. It looked warm, as though the sun was high and bright, just as it might be in the height of summer. The light in the puddle didn't match the light in the air. The colors didn't align with the chill that was beginning to creep in around me. It wasn't just the sky either. As I looked closer, I noticed that the trees reflected in the puddle didn't match the ones around me. The trees on the street were bare, their branches starting to stretch out, naked and fragile, the last remnants of their leaves scattered on the ground. But the trees in the reflection were lush, full of bright green leaves, heavy with the fullness of late spring. It was a stark difference, as if I were staring into another season, a world where autumn had never come. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. It was the strangest feeling, like I was standing at the threshold of two worlds. My mind couldn't reconcile the seasons in the reflection with the reality around me. I had heard of such things before, moments when reality seemed to slip, when things felt out of place, but this was the first time I had experienced it firsthand. The longer I stood there, the more disorienting it became. The air felt colder, the fog thicker, and yet the reflection remained unchanged, untouched by the chill of the morning. I stepped back again, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn the sky in the puddle shifted. Just a fraction, as if it was subtly trying to draw me in. I rubbed my eyes again, but when I looked at the puddle once more, it was exactly the same. The summer sky, the green trees, the bright sun shining in the mirrored surface. Everything was still there, frozen in time. I turned away, feeling a sudden urge to leave, to break the spell that had settled over me. But as I walked away, my gaze lingered on the puddle one last time. The reflection seemed to be watching me, following me with an almost eerie persistence. The world around me felt hollow, distant, like I was moving through a place I didn't quite belong. I didn't look back again, but as I continued my walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a place where time didn't work the way it should, that maybe just for a moment I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The bus arrived as I reached the stop, and I climbed aboard, trying to push the unsettling image of the puddle out of my mind. The rest of the day passed Like any other, the mundane rhythm of work and routine returning, but whenever I think back to that moment, I can still see the reflection in the puddle, the summer sky, the green trees, the warmth of a season that was long past and sometimes late. At night, I wonder if I was looking at something more than just a puddle. Something otherworldly, something that was showing me what could have been, or perhaps what never was, and I still can't help but feel that. Somehow I caught a glimpse of a world that existed just beyond my reach, slipping away the moment I turned my back on it. The rain had been falling heavily all evening, a relentless downpour that seemed to saturate everything. It was the kind of storm that made the streets gleam with a slick, reflective surface, the air thick with the smell of wet pavement, and the distant hum of traffic. I had been walking home from work, my footsteps quick, my jacket pulled tight against the wind, trying to avoid the worst of the storm. The sky had darkened earlier than usual, the clouds hanging low, almost suffocating in their heaviness. I had crossed the park just as the rain began to intensify. The path ahead was nearly deserted, save for a few hurried figures there, heads down trying to stay dry. I was nearly at the corner when I saw her. She was standing by a bench near the old oak tree, her posture rigid, unmoving, a woman tall with long dark hair, her back to me as she stood perfectly still holding an umbrella. I didn't think much of her at first. People often stop to rest or take shelter under the trees during the rain. But as I walked closer, something about her caught my eye. It wasn't the way she held the umbrella. At first glance it seemed perfectly normal, but when I was close enough to see her more clearly, I noticed something strange. The raindrops were passing straight through the fabric of the umbrella. I watched, perplexed, as the heavy drops fell from the sky, only to dissipate the moment they touched the umbrella's surface. It was as if the umbrella wasn't there at all. The water simply passed through it, falling onto the ground without touching the woman at all. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. My first instinct was to look away, to convince myself I was seeing things, that the storm had gotten to me. Maybe it was the low light. Maybe the rain distorted my perception, but no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the image wouldn't leave my mind. The umbrella, perfectly intact, should have been sheltering the woman from the rain, yet every drop of water that met the umbrella simply vanished. It was like watching water flow through a sieve, except the sieve wasn't real. There was no wetness on her, no drops on the umbrella, nothing. I stepped back, confused, a chill running down my spine. I could hear the rush of the storm around me, the constant patter of rain against the pavement, but the woman remained untouched. Not a single drop of water had fallen on her or the umbrella, and yet I could see the rain around her, hear the constant drumming on the sidewalk. I wanted to call out to her, to ask if everything was okay, but something in me stopped me. The air felt thick, the weight of the storm almost oppressive. The sound of the rain grew louder in my ears, like it was closing in around me, the world narrowing until it was just me, the woman, and the unnatural calm she exuded. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. She simply stood there, her dark hair soaked, but her clothes completely dry, the umbrella hovering above her with an almost unnatural stillness. I took a step forward, my eyes locked on her. The strange sensation in my chest grew stronger, the feeling of being drawn toward her, of something lurking just beyond my understanding. I wasn't sure why, but I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know why the umbrella wasn't working the way it should. I walked closer, the rain pattering harder now, but still no droplets landed on her. And the water continued to pass right through her umbrella. Then something else caught my attention. A faint shadow at the edges of the trees, just beyond the bench. It was hard to see clearly, but the silhouette seemed to be watching us, lurking just out of sight, its form shifting in the rain. I froze, my heart racing, as the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the woman anymore, there was something else, something I couldn't quite make out, lurking at the periphery of my vision. I turned my gaze back to the woman, my eyes frantic now, searching for some explanation, some sense of logic. But instead of her face, all I saw was her hand, the one holding the umbrella, slowly beginning to tremble. Her fingers twitched as though struggling to grip the handle, and then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the umbrella began to ripple as if it were made of some thin liquid fabric, dissolving before my eyes. I stepped back, instinctively, my feet stumbling over the wet pavement. The umbrella, once so solid, was now nothing more than a blur of shape and shadow, and just as it completely vanished, I saw her face, pale, emotionless, as if she had been waiting for something or someone to see her. The shadow in the trees moved closer, and I could feel its presence as if it were now standing just behind me. The rain around me had stopped falling altogether, the street becoming unnervingly still, as though the storm had paused, holding its breath. Everything around me felt suspended in time, like I had crossed into a place that didn't quite exist in this world. I turned and ran, my heart was pounding in my chest, the storm's distant roar now just a faint memory. The woman, the umbrella, the shadow, it all seemed to fade behind me, leaving only the echo of an unsettling calm. I didn't stop until I reached home, my pulse still racing, my mind reeling. I never did see her again, and whenever I think back to that moment, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to that encounter, something I wasn't meant to understand, a piece of reality slipping through the cracks like water through an umbrella, and I was left standing there, watching it disappear into the night. It was one of those evenings when the air feels like it's holding its breath, heavy and thick with the promise of rain. The sky had been clouded over for hours, the kind of sky that makes the world feel smaller, more enclosed. I was on my way home from the library, walking down the street with a jacket pulled tight around me, my thoughts lost in the book I'd just finished reading. It had been one of those days that didn't seem to end, full of Aaron's tired conversations, and the lingering hum of noise in the back of my mind. I hadn't expected the rain to come so soon, but the wind picked up sharply, sending a chill through me. I paused, glancing around for some kind of shelter. That's when I noticed the bus stop up ahead, its small, familiar shape like a beacon in the growing storm, a shelter, a small refuge. The rain was starting to fall, then slow at first, then heavier, the first few drops spattering on the pavement like they had been waiting for permission to come down. I hurried toward the stop, eager for the brief respite from the storm. My shoes made soft splashing sounds as I rushed, water already collecting in the gutters, streaming away toward nowhere. The wind was picking up, making the rain whip sideways, the chill in the air creeping under my jacket, making me shiver. When I reached the bus stop, something odd happened. The rain, though still coming down in sheets just a few feet away from me, seemed to stop the moment I stepped inside the shelter. The pavement around the bus stop, slick with water just moments before, was now dry, completely dry. Not a drop of rain had touched the ground beneath my feet, not a single raindrop clung to the glass panels of the shelter. I blinked, confused, for a moment, and then looked around. The rain was still pouring down just beyond the shelter's glass, the world outside a blur of water and wind, but here inside the bus stop it was as if the storm had never even happened. I could still hear the rain, still feel the dampness in the air, but hear nothing. It was dry. It didn't make sense. I glanced up at the bus schedule, but there was no bus coming anytime soon. The air in the shelter felt strangely still, almost too still. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and sat down on the bench. Maybe it was just the angle of the shelter, or maybe the wind had diverted the rain in a way that made it miss this particular spot. I tried to rationalize it, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The way the rain came down so hard and fast, just beyond the glass, but didn't touch me, didn't touch the ground where I stood. It was unsettling. But at the same time, there was a strange comfort in it too, like being in a little pocket of calm, a tiny protected space where the world couldn't reach me. I pulled out my phone, glancing at the time. I had planned to catch a bus soon, but it seemed like I had missed the last one. I frowned, scrolling through my notifications, then put the phone away, deciding to wait a few minutes longer. As I sat there, I noticed something strange in the way the world outside looked. The rain, though still coming down hard, seemed almost surreal, as if it were happening in a parallel world just beyond the thin glass separating me from it. The street outside, the trees, the cars speeding by, they all looked distant, muffled, as if I weren't seeing them clearly. The streetlights had begun to glow softly, their light flickering slightly, as if the electricity were struggling to stay consistent. The storm outside was chaotic, but inside the shelter everything was unnervingly calm. I leaned forward, pressing my hands to the cool metal of the bench, looking out into the storm. The contrast between the shelter and the world beyond, it was almost too perfect, like it wasn't supposed to be this way. I could see the water streaming down the street, the puddles beginning to form, but the dry spot where I sat felt too precise, too deliberate. I glanced at my watch. It had only been about 15 minutes, but something about this moment felt timeless, as though I'd been sitting here for far longer, lost in a loop of time I couldn't quite grasp. My fingers nervously drummed against my legs. The rain outside was picking up again. Louder, more insistent, but I still wasn't getting wet. It was as if the storm couldn't touch this spot, this small little pocket of reality where I existed then. For the first time since I'd arrived, I looked to my right. The bench beside me, though clearly part of the shelter, appeared almost untouched. No water had pooled around it. There wasn't even a trace of wetness on the metal frame or the wood slats. Nothing, like the rain had ignored it entirely, as though it didn't exist in the same world. I shifted uneasily in my seats. Something wasn't right. The longer I sat there, the more the stillness around me started to feel unnatural, the kind of quiet you don't want to acknowledge, the kind that sets your nerves on edge, making you feel like you're on the verge of something you can't see but know is coming. I stood up quickly, as if to shake off the unease that had begun to cling to me like a second skin. The moment my feet left the shelter, the cold rush of rain hit me like a slap to the face. I gasped, stepping backward instinctively, my shoes sinking into the wet ground beneath me. The wind kicked up again, the rain biting against my skin, and the world seemed to come back into focus. I turned back to look at the bus stop one last time, the shelter, the bench. Everything was just as it had been before, dry and untouched by the storm, but it was too perfect to still. As if the rain had never been real in the first place, as if I had stepped into a place that didn't belong to this world. I walked away quickly, my heart pounding, the storm soaking me through, the feeling of being watched creeping along my spine. I tried to shake it off, but as I turned the corner, I glanced back at the bus stop one last time, and just for a moment, a fleeting moment, I could be sworn I saw someone standing there, watching me from inside the shelter. But when I blinked, they were gone, and the rain continued to fall, as if the shelter had never been dry, as if I had never been there at all. It's strange the way some memories cling to you more like a shadow than an image, a whisper rather than a voice. This one has been with me for a long time, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for a quiet moment to emerge, and tonight as I sit here staring out at the rain-soaked streets, it feels like it's about to flood my thoughts all over again. It happened on a night like tonight, dark with the kind of rain that doesn't stop, that soaks through everything, leaving everything slick and shimmering under the streetlights. I remember it clearly. I had been out for a walk trying to clear my head, as I often did. I had been feeling off for a while, a strange sense of disconnection, like the world was out of sync with me, or maybe I was out of sync with it. The walk was supposed to be an escape from whatever was gnawing at me, but it quickly became something else. The street I was on was one I knew well. I had walked it dozens of times, a quiet street in my neighborhood, lined with old houses and heavy trees that dripped with the rain. The gutters were already beginning to overflow, the water rushing along the edge of the pavement in steady streams. The sound of the rain was constant, like a soft, rhythmic lullaby, except it wasn't soothing. It felt more oppressive, like the air itself was heavy with something unsaid, something waiting. As I walked along, I felt the temperature drop. The air was thick, humid with the rain, and the wet ground beneath my feet made every step sound louder than it should. I hadn't realized it at first, but the street was more flooded than I expected. The rain had fallen in such a continuous heavy torrent that the gutters were nearly full, the water creeping up toward the edges of the sidewalk. But as I walked, I didn't think much of it, not until I reached the spot where the water had begun to pool in the middle of the street. A thin layer of it, stretching out like a shallow pond. The water was still dark, reflecting the lights above it. Like a glass mirror, it was beautiful in a way, but unsettling too. The water wasn't just reflecting the streetlights or the trees, it reflected me too. At first I didn't think much of that either. I had passed puddles before, seen my reflection briefly in the surface of the water, but this time was different. My reflection didn't behave the way it should have. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the ripples in the water, making it look like my reflection was moving slightly, just out of sync with my own movements. But no, the longer I stood there, the more I realized it wasn't a trick. It wasn't the water distorting the image, it was me. I stopped walking, my feet planted in place. My reflection in the water kept walking. It moved without hesitation, without a moment's pause, but it wasn't following my movements. No, it was ahead of me, stepping out onto the water, as though it was walking on the surface, the way one would walk on solid ground. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to look away, to convince myself that I was seeing things, that the exhaustion of the day was playing tricks on my mind. But no, my reflection was still there, walking slowly across the water, each step leaving ripples behind it. It moved smoothly, steadily, like it was unaffected by the water, unbothered by the way it should have been, sinking, falling into the deep flood beneath it. The water should have been pulling it down, dragging it under, but no, it stayed above, walking with effortless grace. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The water felt colder now, almost biting, but when I looked down at my feet, they didn't touch the water. My reflection, however, continued to glide across it, its form more solid, more real than I felt in that moment. A whisper of panic gripped me, tightening around my chest like a vice. What was happening? Why wasn't I walking on the water like that? I glanced around, searching for something, anything that could explain this. The street was silent, the only sound, the constant drumming of the rain. There were no cars, no people, no movement except for my reflection. It felt wrong. All of it felt wrong. I took a step closer to the water, my eyes locked on the figure of myself moving a head growing further from me, as if it didn't need me anymore. The water under it didn't ripple, didn't shift, as though the reflection existed in its own world, its own space, completely separate from mine. I wanted to call out, but my voice felt lodged in my throat. I took another step forward, and that's when I noticed something else. The reflection was moving faster now, as if it was picking up speed, leaving me behind. It wasn't stopping, it wasn't slowing, it was walking toward the end of the street. The street where the water was the deepest, where the shadows seemed darker, more consuming. I reached out, but my hand didn't meet anything. The street was still eerily calm, the water pooling around my feet now, but I felt no connection to it. The reflection continued its path unbothered, not even glancing back, and I was stuck, frozen in place, watching it disappear into the darkness. The rain fell harder, the street seemed to stretch further than it had before, as though the distance between me and my reflection was growing longer, wider, stretching into an impossible, infinite void. The world around me felt like it was slipping away, like I wasn't part of it anymore, like I was witnessing something that didn't belong to me. And then, as the figure of my reflection faded into the shadows, the water beneath me began to rise. It crept up slowly, quietly, the cool fingers of it touching my ankles, my calves. The water moved in waves, not from the rain above, but from something beneath, something deep in the street, pulling it up toward me. My reflection was gone, lost to the shadows, but I couldn't look away from the water now. It was all around me, crawling up my legs, soaking my shoes, my socks. My reflection had moved away, and the world had shifted, leaving me standing there in the flood, unable to move, unable to escape. The streetlights glimmered in the water, distant and distorted, and I knew somehow that I had been left behind. The water rose higher, as if it were coming to claim me, to drag me under, just as it had done to my reflection. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I was no longer sure where the world ended and I began, and as the water reached my waist, I heard the faintest sound, a whisper carried by the wind, my name again. But this time, it wasn't my reflection calling it. This time, it was something else, something deeper, something that had always been there, and I was starting to realize too late that maybe I had never been walking on the water at all. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the world seems to slow down, and everything falls into a muted stillness. The sky had been overcast all day, and now as night settled in, the air was thick with the scent of rain. It hadn't rained yet, but I could feel it coming, the kind of rain that makes the streets slick and the air heavier. I had just left the small cafe down the street, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, the steam rising in thin curls into the cool night. My apartment was only a few blocks away, and the walk was always peaceful. The street was quiet, lit by the soft glow of streetlights, their lights shimmering in the wet pavement. Most people had already gone inside for the night, leaving the streets almost deserted. I was lost in my thoughts as I walked, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps blending with the distant murmur of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I neared the corner, something caught my attention, a soft whisper, almost inaudible. It was strange, because there was no one around, no one except me, the empty street, and the darkened storefronts. The wind didn't seem to carry it, and yet I heard it so clearly that it stopped me in my tracks. It was my name. My first thought was that it was a trick of the mind. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was just a random sound that happened to resemble my name. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one in sight. The street, as empty as it had been moments ago, stretched out before me like a lifeless canvas. Then the voice called my name again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere near me, it was coming from below. I looked down. At the ground, at the wet pavement beneath my feet, the voice seemed to rise from the gutter as if it were trapped in the cracks of the street. Itself, my throat tightened, my pulse quickening, as the sound of my name echoed in the silence. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a low, almost melodic tone that made my skin crawl. There was a strange familiarity to it, like I should know who was calling me, but I couldn't place it. I felt a cold, chill run down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, as though that might make the voice go away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky and louder than I intended. Silence. Only the distant hum of the city and the faint rustling of leaves remained. No footsteps, no other voices, just the soft patter of rain beginning to fall, the first few drops hitting the pavement with a quiet hiss. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned away, telling myself that I was just hearing things, that the city was playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was probably just imagining things. But as I continued to walk, my feet moving faster now, I heard it again, my name. It was coming from the gutter. I stopped in my tracks. Once more, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice was unmistakably clear, as if someone was standing right there, just beneath the street. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, calling me over and over again, my name rolling off the tongue with an unsettling sweetness. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, compelled by something I couldn't explain. The voice was familiar, almost comforting, like the way a loved one might call out to you after a long absence, but there was something off about it. Something that made my stomach turn. I looked down again, this time more carefully, trying to see what could be causing the sound. The gutter was dark, the water in it moving slowly, almost lazily, as if it were pooling in a stagnant stream. I leaned forward, my breath fogging up the cold night air. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something shift in the shadows. A figure maybe, but it was so fleeting, so quick, that I doubted myself. But then the voice came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. "Come closer," it whispered, and for a moment I thought I heard a soft laugh, almost a giggle, but twisted it. It was then that I realized the voice wasn't human. There was something hollow about it, something ancient and unearthly, like it had been trapped in the earth for a long time, waiting for someone to listen. My instincts screamed at me to run, to turn around and never look back, but my legs felt like lead, my mind hazy with fear. The rain had started falling harder now, the droplets slapping against the pavement, but the world around me was suddenly too quiet to still. Even the sound of the rain seemed muffled, like it was being swallowed by the shadows. "Don't be afraid," the voice crooned, softer now, like it was trying to soothe me. "I'm just waiting for you." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My eyes darted around, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, the buildings silent. Everything felt wrong, like the world around me had shifted into something unrecognizable. Finally, I forced myself to move. My legs, stiff with fear, carried me forward at a slow, hesitant pace. But each step felt like an effort. The voice didn't stop. It called my name again, but this time it was almost like a plea, desperate, broken, as if it was begging for something or someone. I glanced down at the gutter one last time, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark water flowing steadily as the rain continued to fall. The voice had stopped. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but the unease lingered, crawling under my skin, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I didn't look back as I hurried the rest of the way home, but I could still feel it, the voice calling from the depths of the street, as if it were attached to me now. following me. When I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me, I tried to shake off the feeling. Tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the mind, but even as I sat down on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was still out there waiting in the dark, calling my name from the gutter, and I knew deep down that it hadn't forgotten me, that it was still out there, calling, waiting. The rain had been falling for hours, thick and relentless, like the sky had opened its floodgates and forgotten how to close them. It was the kind of rain that made the world look blurry, like everything outside had been painted in watercolors. I watched it from my window, a constant stream of droplets racing each other down the glass, the trees bending under the weight of the downpour, the kind of rain that makes you want to stay inside, curl up with a book, and forget about the world outside. I had just gotten home from work. My day had been long, full of mundane tasks that seemed to stretch on forever. So when I walked through the door, I was grateful for the silence of the apartment. It was quiet, too quiet, actually, which struck me as odd, because the rain outside was so loud, so constant. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the world. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flash of headlights or the silhouette of someone rushing to their car. I took off my coat and hung it up. The air inside was cool, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. I walked over to the window, wanting to take a moment to appreciate the storm. I loved rain. I loved how it made everything seem distant and dreamlike, how it softened the edges of the world. But then something strange happened. I glanced down at my feet and realized I was standing on the carpet, dry. I looked up confused and realized that despite the rain falling hard outside, I wasn't getting wet. I could see the rain here, it pounding against the glass, feel the rush of cold air seeping through the window as it rattled from the force of the storm, but not a single drop was touching me. I took a step back, perplexed. Maybe I'd imagined it, I thought. Maybe it was just the angle of the window, the way the rain splattered against the glass. But when I stepped closer again, the same thing happened. The rain continued to fall, but I was dry. I stood there, staring out the window, a growing sense of unease settling over me. There was no way this could be real, no way that the rain could be falling all around me and not touching me. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized it was true. I could see the wetness on the outside of the glass here, the rain as it hit the ground below, but I wasn't feeling a single drop. The sensation of being untouched, untethered from the world outside began to feel unnatural, as if I was watching the storm from another dimension, like I wasn't really part of it. I reached up instinctively to feel my hair, my face, but they were dry too. I turned away from the window, my heart racing. My mind tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the storm was simply contained to the outside world, some strange, inexplicable phenomenon that didn't affect the inside of my apartment. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. I walked around the apartment, moving from room to room, checking the windows, the doors everywhere. The rain outside was falling heavy and constant, yet the air inside remained dry. It was as if I was living in some strange bubble, shielded from the world, but I didn't know how or why. My footsteps echoed in the empty rooms, a sound that seemed louder than usual, somehow disconnected. The world outside felt so close, so present, yet so distant, as though I were watching it through a lens. I stopped in the living room and sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself, to make sense of it. My mind was racing, but no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the rain. I realized it was the stillness of everything. The way the world outside seemed to be moving, but I wasn't. I was stuck in this bubble of quiet, untouched by the storm, untouched by the world. The sound of the rain, once comforting, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me, growing louder with every passing minute I got up and moved to the window again, my hands trembling as I reached for the glass. I needed to understand. I needed to know why I was standing here dry when everything else was drenched. But when I opened the window, the air outside didn't feel like it should. The cool, wet breeze was gone. It was as if the storm, the rain, everything outside had been muted, removed. I could still hear it, see it, but the sensation, the moisture, the coldness, the very essence of it was missing. It was then that I noticed something else. The world outside had stopped moving. The rain, which had been pouring relentlessly just moments before, had stopped mid-fall. The drops hovered in the air, suspended like glass beads frozen in place. The wind that had been howling outside, whipping the trees and making the windows rattle, had died. The streetlights, which had been flickering as the storm raged, now stood perfectly still there. Light caught in the stillness of the moment. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was feeling. But when I opened them again, everything was different. The world outside the window was still, completely still, like a photograph frozen in time. The storm had stopped, and yet the rain was still falling, still hanging in the air, frozen in time. I stepped back from the window, my mind reeling. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the impossible scene in front of me. I didn't understand what was happening, why the rain wasn't touching me, why the world outside had stopped moving. I moved slowly through the apartment as if I were stepping into a world that wasn't my own. Everything felt alien now, disconnected. I turned off the lights, hoping that would help clear my head, but it didn't. I sat in the dark, the silence pressing in around me, the sound of the storm outside deafening in its stillness. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. The rain continued to fall outside, but I wasn't getting wet. And in that quiet, strange stillness, I realized that I didn't know how to leave, how to return to the world I had once known. I only knew one thing for sure: I was no longer part of it.